the Urantia book speaks of superior races, it is not referring to the intrinsic value of those races. The Father is no respecter of persons. God loves each and every person unconditionally.
The Urantia book goes beyond racism in that it's not only dealing with the evolutionary material aspect of humanity, but it also goes above to the soul and the eternal destiny of humanity.
I am so very happy to introduce our next speaker, our next presenter, Gard Jameson. Gard is going to talk about one of the most difficult issues of our day and time. Gard's title is A Great Confusion About Race, a Sociological and Genetic Meditation. Gard, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Miss Marjorie. I appreciate it. This subject of race has been on all of our minds, those of us that have been reading the book for a long time. And for some of us, it causes us a little discomfort. For some of us, it causes great discomfort. And for some, people have put the book down because of it. And what I want to do is sort of diffuse, if you will, the anxiety around that topic in this revelation. Last night, I was with 100 students from Taiwan, and we were introducing the Urantia book to them. And guess what topic I used to introduce the Urantia book? Race. Wow, you would think, well, that's not a very good topic to start the Urantia book, but they are loving it, and they're appreciating, if you will, as we look at the contrasting statements within the book, how the revelation really is just what it is, a revelation. There you are. Somewhere on that little orb. And what we know is paper 196, a very important statement in the book, that evolution and revelation work together. And as the Chinese would wish you, may you live in interesting times, you live in interesting times. Why? Because you have an evolutionary perspective and a revelatory perspective. And what I hope to share with you today is the realization that you can hold the tension of those opposites. And indeed, they are opposites. In some fashion, evolution is grounded in fear, revelation is grounded in divine love. And so we're going to move forward as we consider how evolution and revelation relate to one another. So at 533 Diversity, we have a little hallway. It's the life carrier hallway. And there we provide, if you will, a little bit of a narrative of the evolutionary story on our planet. And I'm going to put my pointer over here. This was a lovely painting that I found in New York City. And for me, it sort of evokes the sense of beginnings or origins. And then we have the story of the history of our planet. This is a lovely painting you'll see in a little bit, which shows the evolution of life. And we have, if you will, the Archaeozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic here represented in this case at 533. And then we have recent times, which, as we know, civilization is really only about 10,000 years old from a documented standpoint. But we also have in the case 3 vases, which are interesting vases because each one of them has, if you will, 3 concentric circles. This first one from Cyprus, the home of the second epical revelation. This second one was found in Hebron, which was the home base of Melchizedek, the third epical revelation. And interestingly, this one was found in Bethlehem, the origin of the 4th epical revelation. And you can see, interestingly, here, 3 concentric circles, and there's 3 below and 3 above. I don't know, there's no writing associated with it, but I think whoever did this pot was trying to get a word across. Just as this little piece from Sumer, which is some of the most ancient writing, cuneiform, provides a wonderful tale about how the great warrior was really in trouble with the great god Enlil because the great warrior had awoken him from his sleep. Well, that's how it works in my house too. Wake me up from my sleep and you're in trouble. So what we know from the book paper 7 is that the Father has instituted what we call the plan of progressive attainment. It's a plan of evolutionary ascension. So whether you like it or not, evolution is encoded not only in your DNA, but it's encoded in the culture. It's all around us. And so we better get familiar with it, and we better understand the importance of it. So this, again, this plan provides for the upstepping of creatures of time culturally and genetically and spiritually. And it involves the Father's bestowal of the thought adjusters and endowing us with the prerogatives of personality, which, as Phil likes to point out, agency. We've got free will. And there's a picture of Fanta. I don't know where I got it, but she tried to send greetings and was denied. Oh my goodness. And there's Andon. He tried to send greetings. He was denied as well. So again, when the mortal nature is upstepped, there is the possibility for the spirit of truth to begin cooperating with the indwelling adjuster. And it says to bring forth the beautiful harvest of the character fruits of the spirit. And it tells us something very interesting at the beginning of this presentation, that mortals of a normal world, and I got bad news for you, we're not a normal world, do not experience constant warfare between their physical and spiritual natures. And so that's just sort of a given, scientific given, that all of us, as I like to say to my students, I teach Asian philosophy at the University of Nevada, you all walked in with 2 bags. One had your books and the other had your trauma. For some of you, that trauma is pretty heavy. For some of you, not so heavy. But we all have this internal tension as a result of personal, collective, and intergenerational trauma. One of the human sources, and if you go to Urantia Foundation 533, I welcome you to come and visit. We have what's called a Melchizedek library, and we have a library full of the human sources. One of them was a fellow named Ashley Montague, which is a fairly late source in the development of the Urantia book. He was an anthropologist, and he was asked by the UN to write a statement on race in the early 50s, which he did. And he spoke of one human race, and he wrote a book which was very famous in the 50s called The Most Dangerous Myth, The Fallacy of Race. And there he really started the ball rolling with the appreciation in evolutionary thought that race is a social construct and not a biological fact. And we all know, as we read the paper, race has been, and racism has been part of our cultural landscape for a very long period of time. And here we have from the Tulsa World, the headline of the Tulsa Race Massacre. And what's fascinating is to notice the implicit bias in the headline, 2 whites dead in race riot. Well, guess what? There were 300 African Americans who were murdered in that race riot as well. So I've been thinking a lot about trauma. I've been thinking a lot about race. I've been thinking a lot about George Floyd. I have a friend who's a rabbi in Amsterdam. His granddaughter came to him. He was thrown from a train in 1943 that was on its way to Auschwitz, was raised by a French family. But his granddaughter came to him and said, I want to be a social justice lawyer because of George Floyd. And this is the Netherlands. So we are all, if you will, aware of and thinking about this question of race and racism. And for those of us that are readers of the Urantia book, it's a rather sort of precarious position that we find ourselves in, because as Ashley Montague says, from an evolutionary standpoint, race is a social construct. But what we are told in the Urantia book is that race is also a biological fact. And it's just that statement, that race is a biological fact, which from an evolutionary standpoint makes the revelation a racist text. And we'll talk more about this in a moment. But we're going to soften that blow quite considerably in a moment. This is the painting I was referring to, my friend John Gertsch, and you can see the ascension, if you will, the evolutionary ascension that we have all been through. And the ascent from seaweed to the lordship of the earthly creation is indeed a romance of biologic struggle and mind survival. Man's primordial ancestors were literally the slime and ooze. Wow, I have some friends who are still a little oozy. Of the ocean bed in the sluggish and warm water bays and lagoons of the vast shorelines of the ancient inland seas. those very waters in which the life carriers established 3 independent life implantations on Urantia. So again, to reiterate, what we know is that the Father's plan, this goes all the way back to paradise, the Father's plan is evolution. And what's the purpose? Well, I think William Blake states it well. We are put on earth a little space that we may learn to bear the beams of love. It's not an easy lesson, is it? We've all had our narratives, we've all had our stories and issues, but I want to say that for people of color, it's been particularly difficult. And so part of my learning experience over the last several years as an old white man is to understand my own privilege and to learn to listen a lot. And any of you and all of us who have been given this revelation stand, no matter what your background, racially or otherwise, stand in a position of privilege. And we have a privilege to share something extraordinary to help others learn to bear the beams of love. So what do I know? I know from a revelatory perspective that the revelatory perspective demonstrates clearly that the Urantia Book is not a racist text, that God loves all human beings equally, and we are invited to do the same by lives of selfless service and worshipful communion. To use the words of Ibram Zendi, the Urantia Book is anti-racist. It opposes racism and promotes racial tolerance. Underline this in your brain. The Urantia Book does not promote prejudice, bias, and bigotry. In truth, it teaches and invites the opposite: love, compassion, and selfless service. And we're told in the religion papers, living faith does not foster bigotry, persecution, or intolerance. The Urantia Book is anti-racist. But what I know from an evolutionary perspective, and this is the tension of the opposites that each of us as students of the revelation must hold, that the predominant current evolutionary perspective demonstrates clearly that the Urantia Book, from an evolutionary perspective, is a racist text by virtue of the evolutionary definitions of race and racism. From the dictionary, Oxford, the belief that humans can be divided into separate biological entities called races. Now, you wouldn't maybe think that that is the definition of racism, but it is. Because again, from an evolutionary standpoint, the races are just a social construct. So again, Ashley Montague suggests there's just but one human race, and the narrative that's currently in play is that that race began in Africa and moved out of Africa. And again, through genetic selection, again, different colors began to appear, but it was not biologically induced. What we also know from the Urantia Book, which is greatly fascinating, is that 35,000 years ago, if those first 2 revelations, darn those guys, had succeeded, we would have had 35,000 years ago a cessation of racial conflict, cessation of nationalism, reduction in war, universal representative government. We're still struggling with that one, aren't we? One language, universal education globally. As Confucius says, when there's universal education, all class distinction is erased. One race, and the family of God flourishes. Wouldn't that be lovely? From a revelatory perspective, the Urantia peoples are suffering under the consequences, and all of you know this, of a double deprivation of help in this task of progressive planetary spiritual attainment. The Caligastia upheaval precipitated worldwide confusion and robbed all subsequent generations of the moral assistance which a well-ordered society, cultural evolution, would have provided. But even more disastrous was the Adamic default in that it deprived the races of that superior type of physical nature, genetic evolution, which would have been more consonant with spiritual aspirations. So we are told in paper 51 that the whole scheme of race improvement was early wrecked. Wrecked is a hard verb. Wrecked on Urantia. Again, what do I know from a revelatory standpoint? As a revelatory text, there are new insights provided that race has part of the planet's biological identity. A fact. That there are not currently any pure races. A fact. that evolution and culture are related as cause and effect. This is really important. Evolution and culture, the connection. And 4, that the Urantia Book's prime purpose is to encourage the development of a spiritual culture in which all humanity will exist as one unified human race brought together by a divine purpose. This development is to emerge by many means, including contemplative practice, worship and prayer, selfless service, and a thoughtful and appreciative understanding of biology and of culture. Again, what do I know from an evolutionary standpoint? Again, we're going to play this tennis game going back and forth between the evolutionary perspective and the revelatory perspective. So I have a friend, David Sloan Wilson. He's written a book called This View of Life. He says that evolutionary perspectives are beginning to understand race in terms of ancestry and genetics, and that genetics provides a framework for understanding social, cultural behavior. Interesting. Genetics and culture. Most evolutionary biologists still associate evolution with genetic evolution, ignoring the fact that cultural change is also an evolutionary process. Wow, where did we hear that before? In the Urantia Book. David calls this an intellectual apartheid, the separation of biology genetics from culture. In the academy, whose prejudices are now crumbling before the research. We learn in the Urantia Book, evolution and culture are related as cause and effect. David goes on to say, a firm knowledge of evolutionary theory, which includes our own species, is required to solve the problems of our age. Ralph's presentation on epigenetics and the importance of how we cultivate healthy bodies, healthy minds, healthy spirits. Evolution is still a toxic word. Imagine that, nearly 100 years after the Scopes trial. In political arena, many don't have the slightest idea how evolutionary theory might inform their particular corner of the policy world. Think about it. What I know from a revelatory perspective, there is a divine reason that the epical revelation of the planetary prince predates the epical revelation of the material son and daughter, a major cultural shift predating a major genetic biological shift. Do you see the connection of culture and genetics and biology as the normal pattern of revelation? Have you ever asked yourself why the first 2 epical revelations were sequenced in the manner that they were? Very interesting. From a revelatory perspective, our capacity to help others see that the Urantia Book is not a racist text will primarily depend largely upon who we are, who you are, who I am as a human being. Our character fruits of the Spirit, how this revelation has transformed us as loving, compassionate individuals engaged in acts of selfless service. There's the narrative. How has your contemplative practice, worship and prayer, and your life plan of selfless service transformed your life? I ask you that question. How has it? As Peter was encouraged, right? Neglect not your daily worship. It does have an effect not only on body, genetics, but also on the mind and spirit. And we're told that the sum and substance of Jesus's teaching was the worship of God and the service of humanity. So from an evolutionary perspective, what I know is that there is a system of structural racism at large in our country, in our culture, and at large in the world in many, many ways. What I know from a friend, a woman graduating from Spelman College in Georgia receives 1/2 of what a man from Northwestern receives in compensation. What I know is that there's a great gap in wealth divide. Guess who the upper line is? Yes, it's white people. And the lower 2 lines, Latinos and African Americans. One of the biggest ones is incarceration, the disproportionality in incarceration, the disproportionality in foster care, which is, those 2 are connected, by the way. So again, if you look at African Americans, you look at Native, you see this disproportionality. And I love this quote from page 1 of the foreword. In the minds of all of us, there is great confusion. Anybody identify with that? And so we need in some fashion to bring evolution and revelation together. We need in some fashion to carry within us the tension of the opposites of a revelatory perspective and of a evolutionary perspective. And so in philosophy, we often talk about perspective taking. And I want to thank George Park. He put me on to a quote in paper 12 by a professor of wisdom. And this is in relation to our astrophysics, but he says that the professor of wisdom says that error embracing angles of observation, right? Angles of observation. And each of us has a different angle of observation depending on your personal experience. You all know the story of the blind man and the elephant, I hope. Really short, right? Each one of us has a different experience. So the one at the back says, well, I know what an elephant is. He's blind. It's like a rope. It's a smelly rope, but it's like a rope. And the one in the front says, no. I've actually experienced an elephant, and the elephant is more like a hose. You really wouldn't want to drink its water, but it's like a hose. And each one of us has a different angle of observation. And that, my friends, is where most of our error comes in our thought process. That's why we need to dialogue, have conversations, and allow ourselves to listen compassionately to the experience of others. So perspective taking. The evolutionary perspective is the predominant cultural angle of observation. The revelatory perspective is the divine angle of observation. The two perspectives can be coordinated, but leave a quality of tension for those of us that read the book. The best way in which to hold the tension of these oppositional perspectives is to allow ourselves to be embraced by the fact and the value of God's unconditional love in our own personal experience, knowing that there will always be a difference in those two perspectives, at least as long as you and I are alive. But this is how Jesus allowed himself to carry his revelatory perspective. Imagine what this guy knew as a creator son. So he held the tension of those opposites while being empathetic with the evolutionary perspective. As he said in his dying breath, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. And I added, thinking. So a really wonderful philosopher from Great Britain, John Stuart Mill, has written, and this is one of the things I share in the first week of class with my students, to the extent that you speak from your personal experience, remember the story of the blind man and the elephant, you are generally correct. So yes, an elephant is like a smelly rope. Yes, an elephant is like a horrible watering hose, right? But to the extent that you deny the personal experience of another, you are generally wrong. And I approach the class, the history of philosophy, in that fashion to show how, again, each philosopher has their experience. And Karl Marx, coming from where he did, yeah, he had a piece of the elephant, but did he have the whole elephant? No. Did he deny the experience of others? Yes, he did. So did Sigmund Freud, so did Nietzsche, so did all of them. This is what we call the human condition. This is why what's required in this moment is what we will talk about later, yes, and, which is compassionate listening and loving speech. So my friend Carol Schindler, who was just here giving a seminar to Compassionate Las Vegas, is an improv expert, and she says, yes, anding your way through life. Yes, I hear your evolutionary perspective, and as my brother Pato does so well, and let me share with you my experience of God. And why this book is really not a racist text, it's an anti-racist text, because it's about the unconditional love of God. And not just about, it is the experience of. So again, may you live in interesting times, the Chinese curse. Well, each of you as readers of this text live in interesting times because you hold the tension of these opposites, a revelatory perspective and an evolutionary perspective. And as the authors of the book tell us, it is always difficult to induce evolutionary minds suddenly to accept advanced revealed truth. Think how long it took you to sort of make the adjustment to the fact that this is the fifth epochal revelation. There have only been 4 prior, but this is the 5th. Indeed, Dr. Sadler, in his short history, wrote a short history before he passed, said every contact was entirely different from any and all that had gone before. And all this experience was an extensive and liberal preparatory educational training in the expansion of our cosmology, theology, and philosophy, not to mention our introduction to new ideas and concepts concerning a vast array of more mundane subjects. In other words, there was a transition for each of us as we began to see the tension between the revelatory perspective and the evolutionary perspective. And we began to hold that tension. And that's what's made some of us a little anxious along the way, but I am no longer anxious. Jesus said, be of good cheer, be not anxious, fear not. So as you think about this revelation, it's a little insane. So there's a planetary prince. I actually got a picture of him. That's him. There he is. Invisible. So you read a book about a planetary prince that lived 500,000 years ago and he was invisible. Are you kidding? And you read a book about Adam and Eve who were 8 to 10 feet tall and glowed in the dark, right? Really? So all of us have been through something of an adjustment. The perspective of revelatory thought. On an average evolutionary planet, the 6 evolutionary races of color appear one by one. The red man is the first to evolve, and for ages he roams the world before succeeding colored races make their appearance. The simultaneous emergence of all 6 races in one family was most unusual. I am married to an obstetrician gynecologist. And as she says, this is an OB's nightmare. Imagine. And another OB nightmare, right? Invisible children, midwares. Really? You read this book? Are you kidding me? Who were produced through a combined technique of sex and non-sex liaison. Maybe we could do a scientific presentation on this one, Marjorie. How does that work? So the first 2 revelations, as we said earlier, right? The first one was primarily cultural, then secondarily biological. The second one was primarily biological and secondarily cultural. And as you can read later, they had specific goals in mind with respect to each of these revelations. So the question of racism in the Urantia book. So I'm going to give you 2 sets of quotes. The first one, set A, the real jeopardy of the human species to be found in the unrestrained multiplication of the inferior and degenerate strains of various civilized peoples. Whoa, unrestrained multiplication of inferiors with an decreasing reproduction of superiors is unfailingly suicidal of cultural civilization. A few other zingers. I'll just give you one of them at the bottom. If the present day races of Urantia could be freed from the curse of their lowest strata of deteriorated, antisocial, feeble-minded, and outcast specimens, there would be little objection to a limited race amalgamation. Want to introduce you to my niece, Nicole. Nicole is 32 years old. She had a chromosomal abnormality when she was born. Her father made the choice to cut her tubes so she could not reproduce. Nicole is degenerate. She is defective. She is feeble-minded, and she is beloved, unconditionally loved by her aunt and uncle. Her mother and father died prematurely, and we take care of Nicole. We love her unconditionally. But is she degenerate genetically? Yes. Defective? Yes. Feeble-minded? She has the mind of a 3-year-old, not a 32-year-old. She is beloved. This is my Nicole. A very courageous decision on the part of her father and mother to cut her tubes. I have another niece who has epilepsy, and she made the courageous decision not to reproduce. So these are the kinds of decisions which we could perhaps think about and could perhaps come to some kind of consensus. So the second set of quotes, there are no pure races in the world today. The higher human races of Urantia are completely admixed. They are a blend of many races and stocks of different origin. Lack of ideals is the explanation for racial hatreds, right? This is what makes the Urantia book, in my mind, an anti-racist text. True religion is the only power which can lastingly increase the responsiveness of one social group to the needs and sufferings of other groups. Only ethical consciousness can mask the immorality of human intolerance and the sinfulness of fratricidal strife. Only a moral conscience can condemn the evils of national envy and racial jealousy. How can a creative imagination produce worthy children when the stage whereon it functions is preoccupied by prejudice, hate, fears, resentments, revenge, and bigotries? No state can attain ideal levels of functioning until every form of intolerance is mastered. Intolerance is everlastingly inimical to human progress. Anti-racist text. And from the King of Kings, from the Master, from the Creator Son of our universe, I am not concerned with such walls of brick and stone, but I would cause the walls of prejudice, self-righteousness, and hate to crumble before this preaching of the Father's love for all men. Pentecost obliterated all religious discrimination founded on racial distinction, cultural differences, social caste, or sex prejudice. You may ask the question, why didn't Christianity continue that trend? Well, we'll leave that question for another time. The chief inhibitors of growth are prejudice and ignorance. Prejudice blinds the soul to the recognition of truth, and prejudice can be removed only by the sincere devotion of the soul to the adoration of a cause that is all-embracing and all-inclusive of one's fellow men, and I will add women. Prejudice is inseparably linked to selfishness. Inseparably linked to selfishness. Prejudice can be eliminated only by the abandonment of self-seeking and by substituting, therefore, the quest of the satisfaction of the service of a cause that is not only greater than self, but one that is even greater than all humanity, the search for God, the attainment of divinity. So Jesus tells a number of stories. And again, his gospel is so clearly laid out in the story. So the story of the Good Samaritan, the story of the 10 lepers, the story of let's go into Samaria, which was a hated population within Israel. Jesus makes it quite clear. Do not allow yourself to become blinded by prejudice, paralyzed by fear. By the way, those are operational in the reptilian brainstem, which is where most people are thinking from these days. What the Urantia Book is encouraging us to do is to go into the neocortex, which the book I shared with you, Buddha's Brain, by Mark Hansen, helps us to understand. So here's a big one. So the words inferior, superior, this often catches people and causes them to shake a little bit. The big picture in the Urantia Book, and the authors of the book actually, they higher case, right? They put unity in higher case, right? Uppercase, diversity in uppercase, a reason. There are three principles which govern the entire universe: unity, diversity, and what we call autopoiesis, that everything is intended biologically to become just what it was intended to become, and spiritually for us, the human species, without end or limit. Here's a question for you to think about. Are you adept at this art of detecting the basic unity which underlies creative diversity, and at discovering the divine oneness which overspreads all this functioning of plurality? Better perceive the divine and single purpose exhibited in all these manifold manifestations of universal creative energy. Are you? How do we integrate? Can we discover the coherence of these two sets of quotes? So consider the word superior. Superior seraphim receive their name not because they are in any sense qualitatively superior to other orders of angels, but because they're in charge of higher activities of a local universe. Angels are superior to you in spiritual status. Variety is indispensable to opportunity for wide functioning of natural selection, differential survival of superior strains. Remember Ashley Montague, one of the human sources to the Urantia Book? One of his quotes: "The evidence indicates that women is, on the whole, biologically superior to men." And I know this, right? I'm celebrating my 40th wedding anniversary this year. They are superior. Anyone who's been married knows, right? Angels are superior to us, but they are not your judges or accusers. No matter what your faults, the angels, although greater in power and might, bring no accusation against you. Angels do not sit in judgment on mankind, neither should individual mortals prejudge their fellow mortals. So wives out there, don't prejudge your husbands, right? You may be superior, but we are all equally loved by God, correct? If you have a different answer to that question, see me after class. So consider the following inevitability. I love the inevitabilities. I don't know if Chris Wood's on with us today, but we love the inevitability. Is evolution the way of the Universal Father's plan of evolutionary ascension, the plan of progressive attainment desirable? Then must that way forever follow the way of superior achievement and evolutionary, cultural, and genetic development from the bottom to the top. The critical point is that never does the word superior within the revelation suggest qualitative superiority, intrinsic value. It refers to function, extrinsic value. That some angels have higher status does not diminish the love that the Father has for all angels. The Universal Father's love is equal for every ascendant being, be they a divine counselor or a primitive, which would be us, son or daughter from an evolutionary planet. So again, I'll leave this for you to read later. The difference between intrinsic means you have inherent value, spiritual value. So do you get it? The Urantia Book speaks of superior races. It is not referring to the intrinsic value of those races. The Father is no respecter of persons. God loves each and every person unconditionally. And the stories of Jesus, the story of the Good Samaritan, the story of the lepers, again and again, Jesus gives us. And who returned, right? Who returned? Anybody remember? It was the Samaritan, the hated one, who returned to give thanks. So again, when we mix these two perspectives, we can do great damage to not only our own thought process, but to our communication. So Francis Bacon, who is the father of the Enlightenment, says, "You have mixed religion and science to the confusion of both. We have mixed evolutionary thought and revelatory thought to the confusion of both. Our goal should be to unleash the power of revelatory thought to be in the service of evolutionary understanding and cultural development." This happened in the plague, where the priests thought that they were doctors. And as Dr. Ralph Zahrer can tell you, it was a bad consequence. Again, mixed the two perspectives. So we're told evolutionary religion perspective pictures the circuitous gropings of humanity in quest of truth. Revelatory religion perspective is that very truth. Fear fashions the gods of evolutionary religion. Revelatory religion seeks to evolve and transform mortal man into the image and likeness of God. Evolutionary and revelatory religion are progressing side by side. So we must learn how to hold the tension of the opposites of these two perspectives as we move through this life. Evolutionary religion is born of a simple and all-powerful fear. Religion eventually achieves a profoundly simple realization of an all-powerful love. The most powerful response to fearful thought is to become ourselves love-saturated with the limitless affection of the Universal Father. So there's been a dramatic shift. Here is, consider the following case: a 68-year-old Caucasian male, healthy, exercises, non-smoker, non-drinker, 98.3% European descent, primarily Norwegian and Swedish, British Isles, France, Germany, 1.7 Neanderthal. This individual has had a genomic scan, thanks to the work of Craig Venter, who along with Francis Collins decoded the human genome. And on that scan, it showed a median to high risk of prostate cancer. Median to high risk of prostate cancer. You can see my cursor right there. And I will tell you, that was me. Last July, I had my prostate out. But all of these things were noted in my human genome scan. And I won't tell you the other things. Please don't tell Mo if I tell you some of those things. But again, lots of stuff is revealed. So here's the question to you as a parent, or maybe would-be parent: if you could prevent a terminal disease in your child, would you? Right? So these are some of the other things that were shown in the scan. Parkinson's, low to medium, not bad. Medium to high, type 2 diabetes, reducing my sugar. Would you? Would you? And the good news is there is a tsunami of genetic engineering that is happening right as we speak. And you can read the book. I'll leave it to you to read, Hacking Darwin. I encourage you to read it, but it is happening. And in the next 10 to 20 years, amazing things are going to happen as a result of Crispr Cas-9, which can begin to cut out some of those diseases in vitro. Imagine. So again, if you wouldn't stop a terminal disease in your child, see me after class. So again, we're all in the process of transformation. And as Jesus was resting at Tarentum, Ganem asked the question about the caste system. And Jesus said, before God and in the spiritual world, all mortals stand on equal footing. There are only two groups of mortals in the eyes of God, those who desire to do his will and those who do not. As the universe looks upon an inhabited world, it is likewise discerns two great classes, those who know God and those who do not. And here's the good news. God loves both groups equally, unconditionally.
Thank you, Gard. Of course, I'm very interested in the Crispr Cas-9 system. I have to say, at first, I was concerned because the Cas-9 system allows us to make changes in the primordial cells. In other words, in gene therapy, we just treat the person. It's concerning, I had great sort of ethical concerns about changing the genome that we would pass to the future, to future generations way down the line. And but of course we have that holdover from of the quote about the thing about eugenics that follows everybody. And they have now convened two different mainly ethical consortiums. First one was led by David Baltimore, and a Nobel laureate. And but we're becoming a people that are I see it as a group that wants to help people, not create the super person, and that gives me great hope when I've talked to a lot of people.
Jamie Metzel in the book says issues of equity will need to be front and center in our thinking. So don't think that 2 seminars is going to do it.
No, it definitely isn't. But at least they thought about that. I mean, in the past, because immediately those 2 Japanese guys immediately made those 2 children, we know nothing about. So that's disturbing. But in this country, people were like, we need to really talk about this and think about it. And so,
well, and that's why this revelation is so important,
mm-hmm.
because this revelation gives us insights which are an important part of the conversation, and we need to be in that conversation. So I encourage anybody who is watching this, whether it's you or your children, get into the conversation, whether it's locally or globally, get into the conversation.
Absolutely. Okay. Would somebody else like to make a comment?
I just wanted to say, great presentation, Gard. I really, really enjoyed that. I like the different source material that you brought into the equation. I think, this subject has been something that, a lot of people have discussed with me over the years, and something that I've had to discuss with a lot of people of color over the years when I introduced them to the Urantia Book. But today, for the first time, while listening to your presentation, I just came to the conclusion that evolution is not racist, but evolution is based on the premise of racism as a philosophy. The Urantia Book is not racist, but in explaining the truth about our human evolution, it does fall into the bracket of racism, which is differentiating different races based on their different abilities. Now, that is the truth. And revelation is truth. And some of those truths are hard to swallow. A lot of people I know, black and white, find it hard to talk about genetics. A lot of people I know, black and white, find it hard to talk about race and the different attributes that each race bring to the table. The Urantia Book goes beyond racism in that it's not only dealing with the evolutionary material aspect of humanity, but it also goes above to the soul and the eternal destiny of humanity, which brings us on a spiritually equal plane, regardless of your race, and gives us all an equal opportunity to achieve divinity and finality. So there are two separate aspects of the Urantia book. One is the hardcore truth about our evolution, which some people will never be able to bear because they don't want to face the truth of those realities, and Black people discuss Blackness away from white people because we have a way of criticizing our race based on the weaknesses that we recognize. It doesn't change our equality with every other race on a spiritual level, but on a material level, Black people, when they talk honestly about their own race, they identify the weaknesses that we share. And one of them is a lack of unity. And any race that has a lack of unity has a lack of progress. The other thing I wanted to quickly say is that in talking about race from the Urantia book, it is talking about 500,000 years ago. And one of the key words in the Urantia book is the word were, W-E-R-E. And it says the red men were the most progressive and the Black men were the least progressive. That was were, past tense. Now that there is no pure races on the planet, I am no longer an indigo man. When I go to Africa, I am not Black, I am brown. I see Black people in Africa that are black like my shirt, and they make me feel light-skinned. But to wrap up, there is no pure race on the planet anymore. So when you look at the majority of Black people around the world, you are looking at members of the new mixed race, just different shades. And we have the ability right now to contribute equally in any avenue of race, because we incorporate every race.
Thank you, my brother.
You're welcome.
Okay, Gard, could you hold up the books that you did, or just so that the audience may get a chance? Yeah, Hacking Darwin, and you showed us another one earlier that was about yeah, that one. I've actually read. I've read that. That is a great book. It is a wonderful book. Yeah. Okay.
Now you know why I wear glasses.
Right. Well, me too. I mean, we all have to. So anyway, we've got some questions. So, is spiritual receptivity based on biological race, cultural environment, UB and eugenics, or what? What do you think drives spiritual receptivity?
Well, when there's an equilibrium of energies that are physical, mindal, and spiritual, there's an optimum of light that can be imparted to the individual. So I think, part of what some people do is they think, well, I'm just going to be a spiritual person. No, well, you've got to exercise and you've got to nourish yourself correctly and you've got to take care of your mind. You've got to keep negative thoughts out of your brain wave. You've got to, if you will, take those neural pathways seriously. So if you're being triggered with anxiety or fear or anger, you've got to look at that triggering mechanism and mindfully diffuse the bomb. As Hafiz says, how can I have God when there's a loaded gun inside of me? So we have to take responsibility for our physical, our mental, and our spiritual natures in order to really advance the frontier of the soul.
Go ahead, Phil.
Well, thanks a lot, Gard and Pato. I've thought about this problem too, and I've always made that distinction of the spiritual value versus the material side of things. But I really liked all of those quotes that you came up with. Great quotes to show the UB is anti-racist in a positive sense, rather than simply saying it's not this and it's not that, which is a little harder to explain. When you start piling on all of those quotes, you have to look deeper to what is actually being said. And then maybe, that point can be made that we are spiritually equal, loved equally, no matter what our status as human beings, as long as we're normal-minded.
Very well said, Phil. Thank you so much for that comment.
Okay, I think Byron's got his hand up for us.
Thank you, Gard, very much. And, over the years knowing you, you've been a very good listener, but you're an even better listener now. Just you can see in the concentration on your face to all of us. I wanted to ask a kind of a difficult question, which is whether the teachings of the text on race are to any extent, in your view, conditioned by the time in which the text came through and by possible human sources. That I actually haven't done the research on that particular aspect of the text, but a lot of folks probably have. And I'm just wondering if the environment in which it came, in the sense that it wasn't going to anticipate our scientific discoveries about genetics, for example.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point, Byron, because in the 20s, race was regarded as a scientific fact.
Right.
And it's not till the 1940s, 50s, Ashley Montagu was writing in the 40s, and he's one of the late sources for the revelation. But it wasn't until then that people began to shift their attention. And I have two friends who are biological anthropologists, and I just innocently, I kind of knew what the answer would be. I said, is race a scientific fact? And they said, not just no, but hell no. And the consensus, right, is the social construct. So again, we have to use that yes and technique in inquiry, which says, yes, I'm hearing what you're saying, and I hold a revelatory perspective which suggests that there is a dimension, a scientific dimension to race. And so again, what we say in interfaith work, as you know, Byron, better than I, is it's the conversation that's important. And when we stop the conversation, we're in trouble. So we have to keep this dialogue moving forward.
Thanks, Gard. And I would submit that there is some sort of conditioning of the text on race, I think, from the context in which it was revealed.
To your point, I will say that most of us on this screen are white and we're older. And what I've learned over the last several years, as I've just deeply listened, as you say, is that we need to understand something very clearly. When you're coming from that vantage point, again, that perspective, you need to let of color speak first,
right?
Because the level of trauma that they have experienced, both personally, collectively, and intergenerationally, is so far beyond what any of us have experienced. Yeah. And so a quality of compassion is exceedingly important as we, as readers of this revelation, interact with people on the planet. And a quality of compassion that really listens in to the trauma, not to the science, but to the trauma that's been experienced by people along the way.
Thank you. Well said, Gard.
Yeah, well said. David is next.
Thank you, Gard. As a panelist, I was fortunate to get your paper beforehand, and I read it once and then I read it again, because the first time it was such a feeling of relief, to get that perspective that the Urantia Book is an anti-racist text. And that was really good to know. And my thought has always been that we all come from that same Sangic family. From the, that's our origin point. We're all from the same family. We are part of the same family. We always will be that. So maybe you could speak to our origins.
Yeah, well, I mean, we have common origins and we also have a common destiny. But what we know from paper 7, right, is the plan of progressive evolution is the Father's plan, not just Jesus's plan. It's the Father's plan and the Son and the Infinite Spirit. So, I want to say one more thing about what you mentioned, anti-racism. So I've read a couple of books, one by Ibram Zendi called How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I highly recommend, and another by Ruth King. And she said something really important. It's not enough to say, I'm not a racist. We must learn how to become anti-racist. Jesus was an anti-racist. In other words, he was against prejudice, bias, and bigotry. He was against prejudice, bias, and bigotry. Why? Because it blocks our capacity to experience the unconditional love of God. We put on a camp every year. We've been doing it for 30 years called Camp Anytown. All of the kids come in the first day, they think, I don't have any prejudice. By the end of the first day, we've busted that myth. And by the end of the 4th day, they're free. They've let go of the prejudice, bias, and bigotry, the implicit bias. And that's the troubling one, which all of us need to investigate. Where are your implicit biases, right? Do you roll up the window when you're moving through East LA, right? What is your response when you see a Black person? What emotionally are you triggered? When you see a story, are you triggered? And so in Buddhism, we say, let us be a little more mindful of what's triggering us personally and collectively, and we can become anti-racist.
Rick Warren makes a good, an excellent comment to David and to Gard when he said, and this quote that debunks the racist accusation is in paper 82. Biologically considered, the secondary Sangits, which of course where all the races came from, were in some respects superior to the primary races. Mm-hmm. So we were already superior when they appeared. They came out of quote superior stock. So that was from Rick. Let me go to Conrad, and then I'll go back to an audience question before we go to Pato again.
By the way, thank you, Rick. And again, please, everyone, make the distinction and understand what superior and inferior mean in the Urantia revelation.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is that since the Urantia book was written before World War II, the word race was widespread at that time. After World War II, it has been replaced by ethnic groups because the word race as such has become sort of taboo. But I understand why, but still, what strikes me in the Urantia revelations, they mentioned that the differentials of times will be eliminated throughout eternity. What we call inferior, superior, all those things will be equalized. And the most important truth that I find in the Urantia book, the word Father is at the beginning of the Urantia book. And Universal Father is the last word also in the Urantia book. It opens up the Urantia revelation and it closes the Urantia revelation. And when I do worship the Father, I realize that each individual, each personality is absolutely unique. And we have each of us have a unique relationship with our Father that we will nurture throughout eternity. But when we say our Father, what's the meaning of our? I mean, everyone on this world, every individual, young or old, but also all the invisible people living on this world, surrounding us, all people living on the mansion world, all people living on the whole universe of Uversa, people, all the people who have always been in Havona, all the thousands of beings living in paradise, when we say our Father, this is our family. And since we have a unique relationship with the Father, he has a plan for each and every one of us. And when we say, Father, may your will be done, we are identifying to this plan. We become part of a master plan that will lead to universal destiny. Just thinking of this, and the whole idea of racism evaporates.
Conrad, thank you so much, Conrad. And I will share again, there are three principles that govern the universe: unity, which they capitalize; diversity, which they capitalize; and what you just said, Conrad, autopoiesis, which means self-making, which means each of us is unique and each of us is in the process of becoming what the universe intends us to become. So there is only one Bill of Rights in the universe, and it consists of those three principles: unity, the right to exist, which is still questioned in our culture; diversity, the right to belong, the right to belong. Think of it. I have a transgender daughter. The right to belong. And third, autopoiesis, the right to become who you were intended to become. This is why the cultural influence of the fifth epochal revelation is so important, because it isn't just about discovering, the Father's will is for me to go to seminary and to be a preacher. No, the Father's will is the manifestation of the uniqueness of the gift that you have been given, that only you can express in this universe epic. Only you. And if you don't, right, as we know from the papers on the Supreme, then it goes by the way. So the Bill of Rights, the right to be, the right to belong, the right to become.
And I like the Oriental mean of salutation, namaste, which means the divinity within me salutes the divinity within you. And
Pato, would you go ahead, please?
When George Floyd was killed recently, it brought the reality of racism in America to the surface worldwide. What I want to say is America is the place where slavery existed, where the Black community of America are still feeling the pains economically, psychologically of slavery. The fifth epochal revelation came to Chicago in the USA, in the same arena. I know without a shadow of a doubt, if the fifth epochal revelation was revealed to Black Baptists, there would have been a much more sensitive tone to race in the Urantia Book, but it wasn't. So the tone is what it is. Now, for Black people in America, we are taught, and around the world, we are taught that we need to have some Black pride. And there's a part of the Urantia Book, I can't remember what it says, but it says something as around the idea that racial pride is necessary for survival. You know, not ego pride, but the pride of being a nation. All right. Now, Black people are trying to gain their pride in an environment where we are suffering. We are traumatized. When we start to search for revelation, when we step out of religion as Black people and we start to search for revelation, we are led to the fifth epochal revelation. We find the Urantia Book. Black people find the book when they are ready for it. When they find the book and they open it and they realize this book is saying that Black people are the least progressive, the first thing they do is shut the book and say, this book is racist. Okay, so Black people face a challenge. As a Black man, the challenge I faced was, which one is more important, my Black pride or revelation? I chose revelation, which meant I had to put my love of race on the back shelf while I continued to study the fifth epochal revelation. Because some people, when they find the Urantia Book, when Black people find the Urantia Book, the first thing they want is validation of race. And most of the times, Black people go to Egypt for validation of race. They forget the entire African continent and only go to where the pyramids are and where the advanced civilization, and they claim Egypt. Most of us didn't come from Egypt that are in America. We came from West Africa, okay? So we turn to Revelation as a sense of identity and recognition. And the Urantia Book does lack the story of what Black people have contributed to the world, all right? That was not the main issue of the Revelation, but it is missing. So when we find that we're the least progressive and all the other things attached to race, and sometimes they talk about race, what was the word God used earlier? Degenerate. Some people attach it to the Black race, but they're not talking about the Black race. They're talking about degenerate stock in every race. But the Urantia movement use those quotes and attach it to the Black race. And then when other Black people see it, they see the Urantia movement as a white man's religion. Now, the other thing I wanted to say, the challenge of the Urantia movement right now is to debunk the racists who are attaching themselves to the fifth epochal revelation. The other challenge that the Urantia movement faces is to have representation of the Black race in everything you do. Now, no disrespect to this symposium, but when I opened it and saw all the presenters today, I didn't see anyone of color. The darkest person was Byron, okay? But there needs to be a Black man or a Black woman on that panel. There needs to be some representation of Black people in everything the Urantia movement does, so that when Black people who are searching for the revelation and searching for truth see it, they can say, oh, I can belong, just as God was saying, a sense of belonging. The other thing is white images of Jesus with blonde hair and blue eyes, looking all feminine. That the Urantia Book says the images of Jesus are most unfortunate, okay? And Black people around the world now are rejecting images of a white Jesus. If you're going to use images of Jesus, make them futuristic, because the future of the world is brown, an olive tan of brown. That's what the Urantia Book says. We're moving towards light and life. We're going to be brown. So let go of this image that we have. Let's incorporate more brownness. And the Urantia Book even says, do not make the mistake of making Jesus a white man's religion.
Thank you, Pato. Let me ask a question from the audience. So should society not allow the mental and physical deficient individuals from having children? Let them belong, but not to the extent who they are. In other words, so if you want to respond to that. Yeah.
So that's a great question. And I'm looking at my brother, Phil, and the issue is where there's agency, of course. So my niece who had epilepsy, it's her choice. It's nobody's choice but hers. My other niece, she has the mind of a 3-year-old. It was her father's choice, right? She didn't have the capacity to make that choice. So I think it's a person by person case study. And that's why they say there are no capable judges, right? And there is a way in which we can be doing something. But the real something of the fifth epochal revelation is the cultural shift that we need to see. As Pato said, this cultural shift where, again, we need to look a little more brown. And we white people need to not be the first person to speak, because people of color are tired of us saying, I know the answer. You may know the answer, but let's listen to everybody.
As a Urantia Book reader, it teaches us that we need to move in the direction of improving our race across the board. To have children who can be guaranteed more than 50% to have deficiency at birth, I think should be discouraged. And that's what the Urantia book says. So as a Urantia book reader, that is my perspective. Everyone should have the freedom to choose what they do with their life. We're not forcing anybody, but we would encourage people to make wise choices.
And absolutely good point. Speaking of transgender folks, Scott Forrester in Phoenix, Arizona asked, after race and class, the LGBTQ community, they're often referred to as atypical mind. What does the Urantia book say about this? I just heard, that everybody of normal mind, and how do we counter that? I think that's what he's asking.
Well, what I will say is, being the father of a transgender child, is that prejudice, bias, and bigotry is the primary factor in our culture's relationship to LGBTQ. And my daughter gets messages on Facebook saying, just go kill yourself. This is not driven by prejudice, by fear, by hate. And again, those are triggering mechanisms, as we're told in the book, and as Ralph might suggest in talking about epigenetics. If we allow those qualities, those emotional qualities, to fester in our souls, we will create neural pathways, and we will give birth to children who are equally prejudiced. And so we just need to stop the cycle now. As my daughter said, I felt okay to come out in my generation, but there's no way I would have ever come out in your generation or grandpa's generation. So the book doesn't specifically speak to, but I think it does when it says that their God is no respecter of persons, period.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that one. Pato, speaking about all the white people here, let me just make this one comment. We issued 8,500 invitations to people to participate in this, okay? To be quite honest with you, we got 9, and then of course me. And so we have a total of 10 people. We've also, with the exception of Jenny Martin today and Marta Elders at the very first one, I have been the lone woman in all of this. Okay. So we've got a problem about women and color but all we can do is ask people to participate. Okay. And I don't know how else to do it. I will tell you that in science as a whole, 25 years ago, the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health realized that there was a problem about racial bias, because you would go into a lab and you wouldn't see anybody that didn't look just like me. Okay. And they realized that. And so consequently, they began to offer, more scholarships and more things like that. That still has not been overcome. It's like so many racial things in this country. It has not been overcome. However, there are people of color that are making huge inroads. At least now, when you look at a faculty on a medical school, they're not all white anymore. I mean, that to me, that's huge progress, because that's kind of like one of the last bastions of whiteness, or are these higher levels. All we can do is pray about it and do the things that we can. So encourage your lady friends and your friends of color to apply to the scientific symposium next time. We would love to have you. So anyway,
Right.
Conrad has a comment.
I'm Francophone, and in Quebec, we have the Urantia Association, who's holding a lot of Zoom meetings. And in those Zoom meetings, there's a lot of participants from Senegal. There's quite an extensive readership from that country. And they are Muslim readers of the Urantia book, and their contribution to those meetings is absolutely fantastic. Recently, they held a meeting, an African meeting of Urantia book readers, and people participated from different parts of the world to that meeting. So there's some interesting developments along those lines in the Urantia movement. Personally, I've been working in the Canadian government with people from different parts of the world, Asia, some Sikhs, some people from Arab countries, some Black people, and I noticed the qualities and the talents of these people in a working environment. And quite recently, my whole life was saved by a young woman. I was diagnosed with cancer, and a young Black woman, a very talented woman, saved my life. So when we think about it, we're all brothers and sisters. And that's the most important thing. And we will work together throughout eternity. And just imagine for a moment what life will be like when we'll be mastered in the core of finality. That will happen one day.
Thank you, Conrad. We've had some very good comments. First, Andrew Froelich said, my way of seeing things is that God estimated it would take 7 trillion inhabited planets to allow for all the possible evolutionary paths from the initial spark of life through to divine perfection, including the occasional wreckage of plans. And then Dave Henry said, paradise personalities do not look down upon mortals.
So it was in 1999, I was at the Parliament of World Religions, and we heard a professor there say that the culture of Africa below the Sahara Desert is defined by one word, Ubuntu, which means I am because we are because I am. And the significance of that word is beyond any of our imagination. And it does define, as Pato and I have discovered, the culture of sub-Saharan Africa. So Pato will be leaving the States and going to East Africa first, and then West Africa, and then from Ethiopia to South Africa, 12 nations. And we'll be filming a documentary on this concept of Ubuntu. And this is similar to Thich Nhat Hanh's word interbeing, which is not a concept, it's an awareness. It's an awareness. So if you think of Africa, they don't have prisons in most of their culture, right? They deal with it through restorative justice, which is a compassionate circling process, which allows the offender and the victim to come together and create truth and reconciliation, as Desmond Tutu says. So this documentary is, I think, really important. So I ask for your prayers for Pato and Antoinette and our team in Africa as we embark, and we hope to share this at the Parliament of World Religions, which I hope many of you will come to. It will be held in Chicago. You can come see the Life Carrier Hallway. You can come see the Melchizedek Library, along with attending an incredible parliament. And our aspiration, at least, is to have that documentary to be shown at that parliament.
Thank you, Gard. Thanks to all the panelists and to all the audience who posted both comments and questions. I'm sorry I did not get to all of them. And I thank you for everybody's participation, and Gard for your wonderful, wonderful presentation.